Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I was the editor and then editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. I now run China Dialogue, which is a bilingual website on climate change and environment with China. Previous to that, some years ago, I was Latin America editor of various newspapers, including the Sunday Times and the Independent, which is, I guess, where my involvement in Latin America and in Colombia began. Since this meeting was organized, as we all know, there has been this dramatic rescue of Ingrid Bettancourt and her fellow hostages, a remarkable event executed without a shot being fired, which would be an achievement in any country and is certainly surprising in a country so characterized by violence as Colombia has been. And a dramatic success for the Colombian armed forces, and another in a series of blows for the FARC, which give rise and give particular urgency and point to the question tonight. The FARC, they were the largest, still are, I guess, the largest, oldest of Colombia's guerrilla armies. And in recent months, they've been attacked in a cross-border raid in Ecuador. They've had very high-level defections. They've lost Raúl Reyes in that Ecuador raid, and perhaps most significant of all, the death of their leader, their very, very long-term leader, Tiro Fijo, is confirmed. In the course of all this, laptops containing crucial information were seized. And one of the things I think would be interesting to explore tonight is what, in fact, the operation to release Bettancourt tells us about the level of penetration, the level of surveillance, the level of demoralization that we might speculate on in terms of the state of the FARC. And if this were to be the end of the FARC, we intend to explore what, in fact, that would mean for Colombia. The present president has certainly characterized the FARC as the root of all Colombia's problems, though many disagree. And it might be an interesting intellectual exercise to remove the FARC from the picture and then look at what we have and where we might go from here. We are very lucky tonight to have a very expert and distinguished group on the platform, and perhaps another expert and distinguished journalist joining us from Colombia. On my left is Malcolm Dees, who's Director of Graduate Studies at the Latin America Center in Oxford and a Fellow of St. Anthony's, and has been following Colombia for probably more years than any of us, but certainly a very long time. Next to me is Alice O'Keefe, who's the arts editor at The New Statesman, she regularly reports on Latin America and has lived in Colombia. She reported from Bogota during the recent diplomatic crisis between Colombia and Venezuela, and in fact the role of Venezuela might be another interesting topic for discussion. Hernando Alvarez was born in Bogota. He is a journalist. He's written for many journals, magazines, and newspapers, both in Colombia and outside Colombia. And he currently is the current affairs editor of the Latin America service at the BBC. And on my far right, Andy Higginbottom, who is secretary of the Colombian Solidarity Campaign and is senior lecturer in politics and human rights at Kingston University. Again, someone who's written a great deal about Colombia and been engaged for many years. And I just want to, just in terms of the format this evening, you should all be aware that this is being streamed, blogged, and transmitted on media probably yet to be invented, something we live with in these times. It's being watched in Colombia. We will conduct the discussion from here for the first part, and then we, as is customary at the front line, open it up to you and indeed to anyone who is sending questions in on this laptop in front of me. And we do hope that we will be joined, I'm sorry, I should in case he manages to make it, Jorge Enrique Botero, who is a Colombian journalist and a particular expert on the FARC, who's written many important reports on the FARC and its condition. We hope will be able to join us on the line. Could that be? But while we're waiting for the technology, as one does, I think we should actually... Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Jorge,
Hello.
¿me entiendes? No.
Do you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, we
he
can
can
hear
speak
you,
English.
Jorge. Can you hear
Hello.
us?
Hello.
Okay, this could be one of those.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Jorge, we can hear you. Can you hear us? This is Isabel Hilton in the Frontline Club in London.
Hello?
Maybe we've just got a cross
Hello?
line.
Hello, can you hear us? No.
One moment, please.
What a shame.
Okay, maybe if you
Hello?
could turn down the transmission and maybe see if we can get it sorted. Meanwhile, I think we should get on. And I want to start off by simply asking our panel members the headline question, you know, in the light of these events, of this, not only the release of Bettancourt, but the series of events that we've seen in Colombia in the last year, I guess, at least. Is it the end of the FARC? Malcolm.
Yes, well, I won't repeat what you've said. I won't go over those points. But I'll say a few things addressing the question, is this the end of the FARC? First is a generality. The easy thing for guerrillas in this sort of organization is to go on with the same. It's very, very difficult for guerrillas to make truces and to make peace. If you make truces and if you go on that line, what happens? You lose your discipline, you lose your morale, you lose your supplies, you begin to disintegrate. Everybody thinks then of their own future, and there is an immense distrust that arises within the group. It's very, very difficult for a group like the FARC too, which doesn't really trust anybody, to think that this is going to be, therefore, sort of an easy decision. If you, in a guerrilla, and you make the decision that, you know, it's all up, we should do a deal, if you go too fast, you run, of course, enormous dangers. Look how long it took the British government to make peace with the Provisional IRA. It takes a long, long time for these things to turn. But at the same time, I think the FARC have suffered recently a number of very hard blows, which Isabel sketched out. They have lost members of the Secretariat. People didn't think that was ever going to happen. Marulanda died, and now we have this very dramatic release of some key hostages. Obviously, the FARC have suffered a great many setbacks. They've suffered a great many military setbacks as well, and their communications within the group are obviously in great disarray. On the other hand, they're a very tough lot. They have the system evolved over many years of survival and logistics of all sorts. They also still have a certain amount of refuge across the borders of neighboring countries, although nothing like as secure as it was even a year ago. So they also, of course, have resources. On the other hand, they haven't got, this is another difficulty, they haven't really anymore, I don't think, got a negotiating position. I would say the only thing that the FARC can negotiate are the conditions of giving up. The FARC are not in the position of being able to demand that the Colombia's political future should be this or that or the other, because their public support is simply totally inadequate for that. And what is more, their methods are entirely, I think, discredited. Uribe hammers on and on and on about FARC methods. Uribe abides by the theory that you have to repeat certain things if you're going to get them through to people until you yourself are exhausted repeating them. And he has done that. And the FARC's methods are now generally repudiated by practically all Colombians. You know, one can argue about the inquestors and how many, but nobody, I think, who knows Colombia at all well will think that the FARC have any substantial public support for their methods. They haven't. They also, I think, have lost enormously in the, if you like, the international contest of the last years. So one asks oneself, well, what have we got? There are questions, of course. There are always questions. No one can be absolute about these things. The efforts that the Colombians have made with American support, but the majority of the effort is Colombian, has been very great. And people do question, can this be sustained? The easy part was, if you like, clearing central Colombia, clearing the FARC out of where most Colombians live and where most of the economy is. The difficult part is in the south, is in the jungles, where there's a lot of, very few people, a lot of FARC and a lot of coca. Coca, of course, doesn't actually help the FARC militarily as much as people think. It pins them down in many ways. It makes them less mobile. What they will do, I think, is they will, what they have been doing is falling back on certain methods. Sniping, bombs by the road, that sort of thing, if you like, very traditional guerrilla stuff. And they still have the capacity to do quite a bit of that. But the general feeling now is that the FARC are defeatable. The great cliche of Colombia for decades was, oh, the government can't defeat the guerrillas and the guerrillas can't defeat the government. I don't think now, if you said that, you would find people agreeing so easily. Some people might say, oh yes, but they, they're still a tough lot. They've still got a certain determination. They still have an immense distrust of the government and the army, in many ways for very good reasons. But they are, I think, very much on their uppers. What I would like to hear again from those many voices who advise Colombians on both sides internationally. Colombia is a country, I think, particularly vulnerable to international advice. Some countries you don't advise. China you don't advise, I don't think.
Well,
not
you can
very
try,
much. You
but
can
they
try,
don't
but you won't
really
get anywhere. Colombia is a country extremely vulnerable to advice. I would like to hear some people saying to the FARC, look, really, it's finished. You should give up. You should make the best terms you can, and you should give up. How many advisors, peacemakers, conflict experts, etc., NGOs have I heard say that? Very, very few.
Thank you. Andy,
Well,
the question is the same question.
I think the FARC have been severely wounded militarily. I think that the intervention of the United States has been key to this. If you look at from the military side, the use of air power, helicopter, gunships and so on, and also of intelligence networks provided by the United States have since about year 2000 given the Colombian army a new lease of life in its war against the FARC. But I think also internally there clearly is a passing of the generations inside the FARC. Now, whether or not this amounts to the setbacks which they clearly have suffered, whether this amounts to their end, I think you cannot address in isolation from looking at the very reasons why the FARC are in existence in the first place. In other words, why has Colombia had up to 11 guerrilla movements fighting against the state since the Second World War? And the real fundamental framing of the question is very important, because if we see the question as one of Uribe against the terrorists, remembering that Uribe is basically Bush's man in South America, right? You see that puts the majority of the Colombian people with the Colombian state. And nothing could be further from the truth. And I'm not advising the Colombian people, I'm saying look at the evidence. The majority of Colombian people are not with Uribe in his project to implement neoliberal capitalism in their country. And if you see the question that way, which is how I think most Colombians experience the problem of violence in their country, then you come up with a very different answer. Because what we have in Colombia is the violent imposition of neoliberal capitalism. And this will breed opposition from the social movements, from indigenous people, from trade unions, from students and so on. And all of this opposition since the Second World War has not been allowed a legal political representation within the system. And this is the origin of the FARC. Whether or not this generation survives with another 10 years, I cannot say. But unless and until the political elite in Colombia accept the legitimacy of opposition to their neoliberal project, then there will be new forms of resistance. Some will take a violent road, some will take a peaceful road. But beyond doubt, there will be continued resistance. And the question we should be asking is how comes the worst human rights in the Western Hemisphere, conducted by Uribe, who bribed people to allow him to be re-elected, why isn't this the end of Uribe? how comes he's lost his foreign minister, he's lost his head of intelligence, he's lost his cousin, or he's lost nearly 1/3 of the Colombian Congress, all under investigation for links with paramilitary right-wing death squads. And to talk about advice, I mean, the mentor of Uribe, he's been dry cleaned, he's been washed, right? He's got very close links, both familial and in every other way, with right-wing paramilitary death squads. How comes he's still in government? When are we going to see the end of Uribe?
Okay, I'm sure that's a subject we will come back to, but I still do want to complete my exploration as to what the future of the FARC is. Hernando.
Well, obviously it's very difficult to guess, as some people have said. It's very difficult to know how FARC thinks. It's an impenetrable organization. They don't listen to advice of anybody. And I will try to get into some facts. There is no doubt that they have been weakened a great deal. According to official figures, around 8,000 of their fighters have been withdrawn from the war, either through a government program that incentivizes them to give up their weapons, or have been dead in combat. It's estimated that they still have 10,000 fighters. And there is a key element that we need to look at this, and it's the money that they could make with the illegal drugs trade. According to United Nations, they control around 500 tons of cocaine a year that could make them around $1 billion a year. So to say that is the end with that amount of money is very difficult. And although there is some figures, positive figures on government perspective, that around 8,000 fighters have been out of the movement, they keep recruiting people. They keep recruiting people. We just heard from Ingrid Bettancourt in the various interviews she had done, and it's people who have no other alternative because they live in a remote areas of Colombia. And something that is very difficult to understand, especially if we watch and see the main newspapers and the main media, is that we're talking about a Colombia that only few people know. It's very remote areas where they do receive some respect. And don't take me wrong, I believe the majority of the Colombian people disagree completely with FARC. But in those remote areas, they get some respect.
And where the state never goes.
Where the state never goes. Exactly, and the way the state has been there is either through the army, but not necessarily through school or something. And I've been in some of those areas a long time ago, I'm not saying recently. And you see on the villagers, there is some respect for them. And they have lost a great deal of respect overall, and I don't think there is a way out for them. When I agree with Malcolm that they have nothing to negotiate at the present moment. And also, but I disagree with you in the sense that there is a left party, there is opposition now, represented on the Polo Democrático. They have managed to win the second most important elected job, which is the mayor of Bogota, twice. And so that's why there's like a no way out for FARC at the moment. They either go and attack urban centers, which what you need is just dynamite. It's not that difficult really to put a bomb anywhere, but it probably will get alienated even further from the Colombian people doing that. They could sit down to negotiate, which will look more as a surrender because they are not in any position to negotiate, or they could just hide and wait. And something that we also need to understand on this is the concept of time that FARC has. They've been fighting for 44 years. It's a peasants' army. You know, they wait, they plant, they wait. They are not urban mentality. So it's something to understand that we're not talking about an urban movement. It's more a peasant, and we need to understand the rhythm that they work. And my first point is very difficult to guess. I will be really happy if Jorge Enrique Botero, who knows them, having talked to them, could be on the line and to listen to him, because it's very difficult to guess what are they thinking, how they're going to react?
Well, I'm sure we'll keep trying. Alice.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions we were asked to look at was whether FARC will further will kind of enter into a process of negotiation for demobilization. And I was actually over in Colombia earlier this year doing interviews with FARC fighters who have demobilized, and as we've discussed, quite a lot of them have already. I think about 1,500 just in 2008. So they are losing people quite fast. And one of the interesting things that the government have found in their statistics is that a lot of people who've been members of the organisation for a really long time are now demobilising. And I mean, that's obviously hugely significant because I think it shows that there is a real problem with morale within the organisation in the sense that they've really lost their sense of direction. One of the guys that I interviewed was, he'd been a member for 15 years. And he'd kind of risen up slowly through the ranks. He was actually an extremely charismatic and charming guy, very idealistic, had gone into it because he wanted to fight for the future of Colombia and all the things that Andy was talking about in terms of kind of economic inequality and so on. And then he'd found as he moved up through the organisation that he was asked to, he became increasingly aware of the extent to which they were involved in drug dealing and drug trafficking, and he was asked to participate in that. And he also found that when he was asked to take over a new area, the FARC commander who'd been in charge there before had committed horrible human rights abuses against the civilian population, which completely horrified him. So he became gradually more disillusioned and eventually left the organisation, and there was a very dramatic story about how he'd kind of run away. But one thing that I thought was really interesting was that at the end of the interview, he said, "Now listen, I want you to turn off your tape recorder. This is completely off the record, but do you know who my new hero is?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Álvaro Uribe." And to have someone who'd been very high up in the FARC say that Uribe is their hero, I think is very, very interesting. And I mean, we have seen people, high-ranking FARC members like Karina, who is this female comandante. She also defected and gave interviews saying that she wanted people to leave the organisation and that the armed struggle wasn't the way forward. We've obviously seen Hugo Chavez say that now as well. So, I mean, I think there is a kind of overwhelming feeling that this really isn't going anywhere now. But I think the question is, and again, it sort of keys into some of the things that Andy was talking about, when you think about the people who are in the FARC, what do they do now? I mean, we're talking about people who make choices about their future and a lot of people in Colombia are still operating with very, very limited options and limited horizons. So, I mean, just to give another quick example, one of the other people that I interviewed was a guy called Juan Manuel, he had a university degree, and he actually used to work in the Hogares de Paz, the peace homes, which are where, when people desert the FARC, they're put into these government homes until they're found places to stay in, until they're sort of put into the reinsertion programs. He actually used to work there, so his whole, job was kind of looking after people who deserted. And then some of the peace homes were closed down, and he lost his job. And the only option he had was to join one of the armed groups because he had all these contacts through the people that he'd met in the peace home. So ironically, this guy actually ended up joining the FARC and working in one of their urban divisions. And again, he was a very idealistic man, and he really enjoyed looking after the young FARC members. He went to visit them in jail. He kind of looked on it as social work, and that's something that I found was consistently true with the people that I talked to who'd been in the organisation. So I think you have to really ask, what can you do with those people and do with all this will to change Colombia and to make things better? There has to be, obviously, a better way to channel all that energy and all that commitment. And so I think, the challenge for Colombia in the long term really is going to be finding a way to do that. And I think even though the FARC are possibly, very close to defeated militarily in terms of, really finding a future for young people, Colombia's still got a long way to go. So that'd be my...
Thank you very much. So we've got a war in which both sides make a lot of money, and those are very hard to stop. I'm interested in Andy, if the FARC fight on, what do you think at this stage they are fighting for?
Well, the last negotiations, which were serious negotiations, ended under Pastrana, under pressure from the United States in 2002. And the end game in those negotiations were actually that the FARC was saying you have to disband the paramilitaries. We cannot go into negotiations which are serious unless and until you disband the paramilitaries. And they have, not for themselves, but for that demand, there is serious popular support. Because in actual fact, the paramilitaries are responsible for 85% of the politically motivated deaths in Colombia. And so Uribe had to respond to that situation, and he started his process of apparent demobilization of the paramilitaries. In actual fact, what's happened is the paramilitaries have been reinserted as new forces from the countryside to the cities. I mean, it's like Maoism in reverse. I mean, the counter-revolution has gone from the countryside to the city. So the paramilitaries have not been disbanded. In actual fact, the paramilitary groups, the Black Eagles, as they're now called, are killing. I mean, since Ingrid Bettancourt was released last week, there have been dozens of indigenous people, black people, killed by the paramilitaries. So the real precondition for any serious negotiations are that in reality, the government-sponsored paramilitaries have to be disbanded. And that will maintain the position not only of the FARC, but of the social movements and a broad constituency as well.
Malcolm, I think you want
Yes, I can't agree with that at all. Of course, paramilitaries haven't disappeared from Colombia. One doesn't believe in miracles. There were a hell of a lot of paramilitaries in Colombia when Uribe took power in 2002, and there's still quite a lot around. But on the other hand, an enormous number have been disbanded. There's also been, it's amazing, Uribe quite recently extradited 14, 15 of the notorious leaders of the United States overnight. Mancuso, Jorge 40, Macaco, etc., Don Berna. Now, I had lots of arguments in Colombia with people on the left, journalists, and they all said, oh, Malcolm, you're a naive fool, you know, what Uribe is doing is that he's giving these people, you know, he's saying, you know, you don't have to have your armies anymore, but you can go on with your business, etc., etc. And the phrase in those days is, they used to say, oh, they used to say to me, we don't share your take. My argument was this is a long-term business. It's a sort of dangerous and very risky chess game. But if anybody thinks that Uribe is a pushover, they're going to have another thing coming. Now, there was very little comment, for example, in this country when Uribe extradited those people, which he should have done, I think, a good deal earlier. But he's the best judge of his timing. There was then a case of human rights outburst. Oh, he's extraditing these people so that they won't stand trial for human rights abuses in Colombia. His measures are entirely to sort of tap the scandals which are coming out. And you had Vivanco of Human Rights Watch saying that in the States. And people looked up what Vivanco had been saying earlier at the time of the Justice and Peace Law. And Vivanco was saying, oh, this is Uribe is passing this so that they can avoid extradition. You really can't have it both ways. And again, how many people would have thought that, I was told frequently that, oh, you know, don't think about Fajardo in Medellin. The person who runs Medellin is Don Berna. You know, Don Berna, marvelous. Now, what Uribe has done is he has, first of all, he gathered them all together. That wasn't very easy to do. And he said to them, you're now passé. And they thought they could go on with their business, with their dominance, by other methods and disband the expensive private armies that they were keeping. Of course, not all those. These things are never perfect. You know, the idea, again, you have people in Europe saying all these people should be tried. Have a look at Europe. Have a look at situations like that in Europe and ask yourselves how many judicial systems have tried 30,000 people, and you won't find any. You know, look at your own country. Look at Northern Ireland. There are a number of you know, murderers and torturers who are running around free in Northern Ireland, and amnesty. You know, we are extraordinarily hypocritical and demanding vis-a-vis this extremely complex situation. But to go on, by where are the paramilitaries now? Those people, those big chiefs, First of all, they lost their mystery. Then they got their ugly mugs in the papers. Secrecy and mystery is part of power. They then were gradually brought under control, and all most of the big ones are now extradited. You also have the parapolitica scandal. You have all the scandal coming out of which politicians did deals with the Paras. And again, which politicians did deals with the FARC. A lot of that's coming out too. I should say probably more politicians did deals with the Paras than did with the FARC. But there's somewhat the precedence between fleas and lice in this particular business. But there's also a whole gamma. There's a whole range of reasons why people did these deals. If you're a politician, you have to get votes. Politicians in Northern Ireland did deal with paramilitaries. This happens. It's life. It's unfortunate. But what is the scandal doing? The scandal is ruining, I'm glad to say, a number of political careers. People will, at the end of all this, Colombian politicians will, they may not be more virtuous, they may not be they may not be better people, but they will be behaving in somewhat different ways. Now, of course, a lot of these people who are being exposed in the parapolitica were supporters of Uribe. They calculated that if they supported Uribe, they were going to be in the clear. Miscalculation. And it's extraordinary to my mind that everybody in Colombia has been digging, all the critics of Uribe have been digging dirt on Uribe since, for 10 years at least. What do they come up with? Frankly, very, very little. If people have, this is a country again with no secrets in Colombia last more than about a fortnight. If somebody tells you a secret, you can read it in the papers 2 or 3 weeks later. And this, I think, is extremely healthy that this is coming out. And of course, a lot of Uribe's opponents use it to sling mud at him. But the idea again that Uribe is not popular, there's the Spanish phrase, tapando el sol con las manos, which is to, shut out the sunlight with your hands, which is not something that's very easy to do. Uribe is enormously popular. That is a political fact.
I just wanted to say, I think one of the popular misconceptions in this country when you read coverage about the FARC, and actually it's obviously not just in this country because it's a myth that they've kind of perpetuated, is that they're this kind of left-wing organisation. And actually, I think that, we should look at that a bit more carefully. They certainly kind of trot out ideological cant, and they teach their foot soldiers to sing revolutionary songs. And, they have the rhetoric, but actually, when you talk to a lot of people who are really working on the left in Colombia to try and make things happen, when you talk to trade unionists, when you talk to people from Polo Democrático, you hear again and again, our number one enemy is the FARC. They're the ones that are totally discrediting everything we're trying to do, because as soon as they try and make a left-wing argument, they can make all the left-wing arguments they want, but they're associated by Uribe and by other right-wing politicians with the guerrilla. And because the guerrilla is so unpopular, it makes it very, very difficult for the left to get any kind of traction at all. One trade unionist that I was talking to actually described the FARC as an ultra right-wing organisation, because he said that they're completely sort of undermining all the work that the left-wing civilian organisations are trying to do. And one of the really kind of disgraceful things I think about the way that Uribe talks is that he often smears his opponents with this tag of guerrilla sympathisers, and it's something that he's used quite shamelessly actually to kind of undermine civil rights organisations, victims organisations, human rights organisations.
Academic researchers.
Academic researchers, yeah, exactly. And I think, he's really done himself a disservice. I don't think he needed to make those arguments. And it's kind of played into all this rhetoric perpetuated by the FARC. So I think that's quite an important thing to understand.
And then Malcolm made the analogy with Northern Ireland and how long it took the British government to do a deal with the IRA. Doing a deal presupposes a willingness on both sides, of course, and the British government was in secret talks with the IRA for a very, very long time before this came out as a public process. And then substantial political concessions, of course, were made. Do you see, looking at the advice to the FARC to give up now, which came from this platform. Do you see any possibility in Colombia of that sort of opening to the admission of the FARC into the political process on the part of Uribe, on the part of this government, on the part of the state, which is, as I say, one of the conditions for this to advance?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think from the government point of view, they would like to see a surrender. And if you look at the language, how they describe FARC, which is something that we need to understand also. In Colombia, things are black or white. Forget the grays. So if you say something that you try to understand FARC, you are a guerrillero. That's it.
Yeah.
If you support Álvaro Uribe, you are a paraco. And
It does make discussion difficult.
It makes discussion very difficult, and I think there is a complete absence of debate in that country, which is my country. And they call FARC narco-terroristas, thugs, all the stuff. There is evidence that they have committed horrible crimes, but so has the state. And I keep, every time I talk about this, is let's not forget history. It's a 44-year struggle, whatever you believe it or not.
Yeah.
You know, let's remember how it started. It started in a remote area, for some peasants asking for a road and trying to get some fruits into the market, but it was in the middle of Cold War, so they said the Americans advising Colombia, which are always advised, and they said bomb them because they're communists. That's how it started. And please don't take me wrong, I don't support FARC, I do not accept their methods of struggling, but to have a negotiation, you need to have a little bit of respect or a little bit of understanding that there is an historical struggle and there is something on there. If they have lost their ideals, probably. When you talk with people that have surrendered their weapon, they say, you know, I remember I also talked to several of them, and one of them said to me, one of the proudest things I have done in my life was to join FARC. And one of the proudest things I have done to my life was also to leave FARC. You know, and he was saying, they said, I was completely upset with FARC. They have no touch with reality, but I'm also quite proud of that organization. And it was actually, it's a great interview that I have that is like 50 minutes long. And my point is, in this kind of language, it's impossible. And FARC do not trust anybody. And just to give you a little bit of context, which doesn't justify what is going on, when they signed a peace process in 1984, 82, I cannot remember exactly the precise date, I think it was 82, when with Belisario Bettancourt, they create a political party, the Unión Patriótica. It was completely exterminated.
They ran in elections and they were murdered.
Yeah, most of them, pretty much around 3,000. We call them Colombian in the media obscure forces who kill these people. And obviously, I'm not saying that the same thing happened now. Yeah, there is loads of allegations about trade unionists, civil rights defenders, and human rights advocates who have been killed by different paramilitary groups. That doesn't mean decided by the state. But coming down to your point, I don't see any place to negotiate. The establishment in Colombia would like to see, okay, FARC is completely done. They're gonna sit down and they're gonna say, okay, give me a taxi and a small house, and then I can give. No, that's not what they're looking for. And on the other hand, to describe him as a narco-terrorist, although as I make my point that they make millions of dollars with the illegal drugs trade, I don't see the FARC leaders as the image that we used to have about Pablo Escobar or the Cali cartel, who is guys sitting in huge houses with jacuzzi, prostitutes, cocaine, having a great time.
A zoo, he had a zoo.
Yeah, a zoo, even a zoo. I don't see the FARC leaders there. They live in the jungle in a really horrible conditions, although some people say that they're being harbored in Venezuela or in Ecuador, but nothing true has been shown yet that they're being harbored there. So, no.
No.
Yeah.
Briefly?
Yep. Just a couple of things. One is the FARC's record as negotiators. The FARC have in the past always negotiated for military advantage. It's often the case, people start negotiations hypocritically, thinking what they can get out of it in terms of their immediate advantage, which is what the FARC on the whole showed that they were doing between 1998 and 2002 with Pastrana. So there's a difficulty there. The Union Patriotica, one thing which is not said, and that was certainly a great shambles, but it was an impossibility. You cannot combine a peaceful political party with an active guerrilla. At the time that the Union Patriotica was being formed and suffering and being wiped out, the FARC were also killing other politicians in considerable numbers of, if you like, liberals, conservatives. Some parts there were more liberal victims than Union Patriotica victims. So this was that then became the alibi, if you like, and the argument, depending on your taste, of the hard line of the FARC, why we can't make peace. Because look what happened to Union Patriotica. After that, there's no argument. But it was something that was impossible. It was the fatal theory of the combinación de todas las formas de lucha, what they call the combination of all forms of struggle. You can't have it both ways. No polity will tolerate that.
Like Sinn Féin IRA
Yeah.
or
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just ask you then, I mean, given this history of mistrust, of mutual accusation, I mean, can you ever envisage a negotiated solution?
Well, this is what
Is it a fight to the death?
This is what I was going to... one thinks and thinks and thinks about what... You know, you have these people saying, oh, we're still in favour of a negotiated settlement. And then one asks them, well, yeah, could you give us a little sketch of your negotiated settlement? And then there's usually silence. Now, I've tried to think of what a negotiated settlement with the FARC could be. And being a sort of romantic, I think that they are a very historically conscious guerrilla. Their achievement is their organization and their survival. And I know Marulanda was very keen on, if you like, having a slice of recognition as part of the history of the country. How you do that, God knows. Do you erect a museum? It's not easy to translate that into practice. The limitation on doing deals with the FARC has always been, if a government cedes too much to the FARC, it'll get trouble on the other side. Because the country has, I think, very little tolerance of large concessions made by the FARC. And people will say, you know, look, these are bandits, these people with guns, they're getting all this, what about us? And one of the things you've had is when governments have taken a soft line with the FARC over the last 20, 30 years, this has usually resulted in an upsurge of paramilitarism. So you have a real difficulty
that point there is actually crucial, and in a sense it's being admitted. You see, what's being said is it's illegitimate for guerrillas to try and combine armed struggle with political representation, which for a period the FARC did do. It didn't give up its weapons, but it suspended its operations to try to test the water, to see if it could enter into representative politics. And as a result, it lost at least 3,000 people. But the combination of these forms is being carried out daily by Uribe and his supporters in Colombia. They do sponsor the paramilitary death squads. There are numerous links between them, and they do take out systematically all forms of civilian opposition to their political position. There's no acceptable neutrality in Colombia. You're eliminated, right? The Polo Democratico is an exception. It's the first time for decades there's even been the semblance of a parliamentary opposition, let alone allowing, let alone allowing a government to come to power which represents the majority of the people. So there's a fundamental question about the legitimacy of the Colombian state, which conducts a dirty war against its opponents. Now, the reason that the FARC stuck to one condition in particular, which is about self-preservation as a force, right? Which is, should they have a zona de despeje? Should they have a zone which is free from the Colombian military, where they can conduct negotiations, where they can hand over people and so on? And in actual fact, their argument has been proved in the negative over the last year, because the demand was for a humanitarian agreement. And quite surprisingly, Uribe brought in Chavez because he can't negotiate with the FARC because they don't trust him. So he had to bring in a third party. He brought in Chavez, and Piedra Cordoba started to negotiate a genuine humanitarian exchange. And it was Uribe who stopped it from happening just at the very point when it was about to give fruit. Ingrid Bettancourt could have been released 6 months ago, right? It was Uribe who stopped the hostages' relief because he doesn't want a negotiable settlement. He wants to militarily destroy the FARC, right? He's a neoconservative. He doesn't want to accept in any way that there's any possibility of a legitimate opposition. And so he then goes on to destroy the very key actor, having got rid of Chavez. He then goes to destroy the very key actor within the FARC who's looking for a negotiable settlement, which is Raul Reyes. And he destroys him in a neighboring country by bombing and going into a neighboring country, right? That was the equivalent, if you like, of a zona de despeje. The FARC needed a zone where they thought they could conduct negotiations or begin to make moves and so on. Uribe destroyed that possibility. And then we come to the release of Ingrid Bettancourt, and here we are in a sort of press environment. The way the international press has covered this, I think, has been horrific in its gullibility. The helicopter which went in to take them out looked like an international Red Cross helicopter. Go and have a look at the CNN reports of the helicopters. They're Venezuelan, Russian Mi-17s. Colombian army doesn't have these helicopters. The guerrillas wouldn't let any helicopter near them at all unless they thought it was for humanitarian exchange, right? These were very clearly disguised, mimicked as international Red Cross helicopters. They mimicked somebody from France, from even Switzerland. They mimicked an international organisation. The guerrillas who handed over those people, all the evidence is, even on their own side, the obvious interpretation is the guerrillas thought they were handing them over for a humanitarian exchange. The obstacle to humanitarian exchange is not the guerrillas, it's Uribe. That's the wrong answer from the guerrillas. If they want to give them over, he said no. Chavez comes in, I'll help you give them over. No, no, no. What we want is we have to destroy the opposition. That's more important to him than getting the hostages released.
But you're characterising the FARC as the opposition to Uribe. I mean, I just don't think that's true. I think the FARC have done more than anybody, any other organisation, to bolster Uribe's support. That's the thing when you talk to the actual opposition, you know.
No, at one point I think that we need to make clear the helicopter thing. I think just let's not forget that it was for the release of people who have been kidnapped for 10 years, 7 years on horrendous conditions. Just that little point.
Well, I commend to you, sorry, just to reply that quickly, I do commend to everybody to read the statement by Fidel Castro, which is very clear about this and which I agree with, right? I think the hostage kidnapping is completely indefensible. I don't defend it whatsoever, right? But the point is, every time the guerrillas have tried to have a peaceful settlement, they have been eliminated, right? About 1/3 of all their forces who ever try to get reinserted get eliminated. What future have they got under these circumstances, right? You have to remove the threat of the violent state. And I don't say that they're the opposition. I actually support far more the social movement's opposition. But it's ludicrous to say that they're in conspiracy with the state. They are a form of opposition.
I wasn't saying they were in conspiracy with the state, but I think de facto, the result of their actions is that they've bolstered basically a very right-wing regime.
Well, you could ask the question, perhaps, does Uribe need the FARC?
Well,
because I think that we would all accept that many people, as Alice said, have been characterized as guerrilla supporters for trying to advance a political opposition or a human rights defense, or, I mean, we've all seen this. Does the removal of the FARC narrow Uribe's ground for that kind of treatment of a political opposition?
No, I disagree, of course, fundamentally with the account given of that. When I heard this, when I saw the hostage thing, I thought, how long is it going to take for people to begin to say the grapes are sour? For people to begin to question how the operation was done. Oh yeah, you've got the declaration in Switzerland immediately where the FARC has good contacts with the media, saying that it was all paid for in advance, etc., etc. Sour grapes. There's a vineyard of sour grapes. But going back to your question about Uribe, I don't myself characterize the Uribe government as either as a far-right government. I don't think that is an accurate reading of Uribe. I think it's absolutely tosh to say that this is a neoliberal government. I don't think it is. And this is, of course, something which
you might have a question or two on that later.
Yeah. Okay, but does Uribe need the FARC? Uribe is certainly very popular because of the line he's taken on security. Security matters to people. It matters to poor people more than it matters to rich people. I mean, this is, again, something where I think there's extraordinary naivety in people from outside Colombia who don't recognize, this very, very basic fact. That's why Uribe is popular. Uribe is very popular. And you can make all sorts of things. Now, we have people say, oh, the turnout in the elections was low, this and that, the other. Don't believe any of that. Uribe is, whether you like him or not, is very popular.
Okay.
But talking about
the
need, there is without FARC, there is no Uribe.
Yes.
I think FARC has managed to elect the last two presidents.
Yeah.
Andres Pastrana by offering peace talks, and then after most of the people who vote in Colombia got completely frustrated by the FARC, elect Álvaro Uribe and re-elected him again because of that. And I think if you manage to take FARC out of the question, then you can check his government. And I think we Colombians tend to look at one problem at a time.
Yeah.
I remember in the 80s, just to go back a little bit, in the 80s it was Pablo Escobar. Colombia was this beautiful country, the paradise,
If
the most
only.
fantastic. If only Pablo Escobar wasn't there.
Yeah.
They managed to kill him and destroy the Medellin cartel. Then in the 90s, it was the cartel de Cali infiltrating in politics, but Colombia was still this fantastic country. But only we have that problem. And now it's the same, but with FARC.
So it is an interesting imaginative exercise to remove Malcolm, I just want, before we, because we do have a time problem, but before we open it up to what I suspect might be an interesting question session, I just want to very quickly address the question of the regional effects of what's been happening in Colombia, because everything's been mentioned: the United States, Venezuela, Ecuador, the general sort of leftist. And I just would like a little bit of context to the current situation.
I mean, this is absolutely key. I mean, here we are in the frontline club. I mean, the Andean region is in the front line of contest between two social models. There's no doubt about it. What you have is Uribe and Peru are supporting very right-wing, neoliberal, pro-free trade, pro-multinational, pro-US projects. And we have Ecuador, Venezuela, and Bolivia, who have progressive governments who are looking to find a new path, trying to create a socialism of the 21st century. And this is the real context of the situation. This is why Uribe doesn't need FARC. What he needs is the White House, and to some degree Europe as well, because he's been trained and programmed to implement a neoconservative program. It's a massive social experiment. People have rebelled against neoliberalism, so what you've got to do is to control society. You've got to use reactionary ideas, the mass media, paramilitaries, to actually get into society to nip resistance to neoliberal economic policies in the bud. So the regional context is absolutely key, because what we have is a contestation between two social models.
Can I say, well, one of the important consequences of what's happened is that obviously with millions of dollars of US military aid coming into Colombia, you've now got this big imbalance in that the Colombian army, as we've seen in the rescue effort, is very well trained, very well equipped, whereas the neighbouring governments don't have anything like the same military resources, and you can see why that makes Chavez jumpy, you can see why that makes Correa in Ecuador jumpy. And because Colombia has been so focused on its relationship with the States, I think it's really neglected to build up positive relationships with its neighbours, and that's something that it really needs to do now if the region isn't going to be completely destabilised.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear there is an ideology battle in the Andes region, as Andy says, and we need to wait. The new episode is tomorrow when President Chavez meets President Uribe. After they have one say that the other one is a mafioso, the other one say that the one will go to international court because it was proved that he was supporting the guerrilla movement, and tomorrow they're going to be hugs and kisses. And it's very difficult to understand. Remember the last crisis when they killed Raúl Reyes? Yeah. You seem like the war is going to start. And 2 minutes later, they were kissing each other.
No, they actually, apparently they really get on very well personally, don't they?
The problem,
who does that worry more?
No, but I think that also the biggest problem is that it's actually something that I read recently, an article by John D. Anderson talking about Chavez, who was saying, judge me by my acts, not what my words. And I think it's a horrible thing that the words don't have any meaning now. After the Colombian president says that the Ecuadorian counterpart and the Venezuelan counterpart are supporting what he called a terrorist group, then he said, but don't worry. What do you mean? And the same vice versa. Chavez is saying all these things at the end, but don't worry, we go along. So
May I have a word on
have a
that?
drink. So
You
it's,
certainly may not.
I think that it's true that a lot of interesting things to say about the international and regional context. One is that I think that people in Europe have got it wrong frequently, that Colombia is frequently portrayed as isolated. But if you actually do look at the region, you don't find that. Go south from Rio Grande. Mexico has good relations with Colombia, partly because it has very similar problems on the drug front. In Central America, Chavez's only significant ally is Ortega, who is a liability. Ecuador is a country of extraordinarily complicated politics, and Correa is chiefly involved in managing them. And again, he's not a strong ally for Chavez. He's much more an Ecuadorian politician than he is a sort of Chavez follower. Lula is not a significant Chavista, and certainly Brazil is a country which will not sign up with Venezuela. Kirchner's there, a couple of opportunists who will, I think, do anything for Czech. The idea, mind you, that Argentines are going to accept Venezuelan leadership is again out of the question.
Yes.
Chile is again much more close to Colombia. Colombia is not that isolated. Take also again the European context and relating this to the liberation of Ingrid. The victor in the liberation of Ingrid, and politics is crude, let us remember that. The victor is certainly Álvaro Uribe, and the defeated are Chavez and Sarkozy, something which has not gone very clearly noticed. Uribe refused to, the reasons why Uribe brought Chavez into the thing are very complicated, and one could go into them if anyone's interested. But Chavez clearly was making a plot with the FARC to manage the hostage business to the detriment of Uribe, because it's most important for Chavez that Uribe should not succeed. He is the biggest stone in Chavez's big boot. Now, Sarkozy again was sort of saying, you know, do it the French way. There are a lot of things coming out about French relations with the FARC, which is worth keeping an eye on if you're a journalist. And Uribe said, no, it's going to be done my way. We're not going to have Chavez in again. And Uribe's tactics were vindicated by this liberation. That's a fact.
Okay,
And his prestige was enormously
very
increased.
brief about the legacy of the conflict and the American aid in terms of the point that Alice made about the size and the professionalism of the Colombian army and what this does to regional balance. Is, for instance, Chavez right to be afraid of it?
No. When Chavez said after the Raul Reyes business, I am moving Minister of Defense, move me 10 battalions to the front. I don't know how many got there, about 1.5, I think. But Uribe refused to move any troops to the borders. Uribe is not a threat. Uribe is not a threat to his neighbors. That is, Chavez again has got, as you know, Chavez's incomes. And now that you know what petrol price is, the price of oil, Chavez buys a lot of military equipment. He buys a lot of Russian military equipment. One asks oneself, again, I'm not a professional military analyst, but I said, what's he want it for? What's he need for? He says to defend the country against a possible invasion of the United States. The Colombians have, I think, quite prudently not taken a good deal of care, Uribe, not to, if you like, do American dirty work vis-a-vis Chavez. There's enormous amount of evidence in Colombia about the degree to which the FARC operate in Colombia, take refuge, in Venezuela, take refuge in Venezuela, get supplied from Venezuela. It is now also notorious how much FARC drugs are going out through Venezuela. There's a lot of tension there, but that Colombia is a military menace to its neighbors is bunk.
Thank you. Hernando.
No, just one point. I don't know if you could personalize this, if Uribe is a threat or not. I think what is a threat is the Colombian conflict, which many Colombians tend to do not understand and do not want to believe that there is a conflict. So I think the conflict in itself is a threat for the region, and there is no doubt about it. There is illegal armed groups going forward and back. Sure. We're talking about FARC, we're talking about paramilitaries, we're talking about ELN, and that's the country who has problems in Colombia. Let's not forget, the conflict is in Colombia. It's not in Ecuador or in Venezuela. It's in Colombia, and it's the conflict that is a threat for the region.
Thank you. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome to join this conversation. If you, yes, so we'll take it. Do we need to pass the microphone? We do. Okay, we need to pass the microphone. If you care to tell us who you are, that would be nice.
Hello, my name's Anne Wright. You've talked a lot about the regional thing, i.e. the regions in South America, but I'd like to go a bit to the regions in Colombia. Because we know Uribe is popular because he's been elected, all that. But a lot of people say that he's very popular in the cities, and that's where most of his votes come. If you go out into the regions of Colombia, often people don't even know there's an election on. If they do, they don't vote. I'd like the panel to say what they think the options are for people, say, in the Chocó, or in eastern Antioquia, or down in Nariño. You know, what are the options for people who are displaced from their land, who have their land stolen for palm oil plantations for biofuels, for example, and whose options are either to go be displaced to the cities or to work on previously collective lands by Afro-Colombians or indigenous people or peasant farmers, or joining one of the armed groups. Well, since usually they're displaced by paramilitaries, one possibility is to join one of the other armed groups, the FARC or the ELN.
Okay, there is a question.
Well, yes, I'm asking, what are these people
to do
who are not Uribe supporters and for whom Uribe is a total and utter menace because of the agenda he has, the neoliberal agenda that Andy talked to? What are these people to do? Will these people continue to fuel the armed groups, for example? Even though they're losing people, will these ones fuel them in the future?
Thank you very much. I mean, it is an interesting question, the degree to which this is a war about resources, land. Is there another question that we want to take before we can take a few questions before we go back to the panel? Yeah. Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Roberto. I think apart from Auntie, I think your name, panelist, the other panelist has lost the point about the FARC. The left-wing organization movement in Latin America is more alive than ever. The FARC represents still the socialism ideal in Latin America and our struggle against Latin American imperialism. You haven't mentioned that Colombia is the poor country in the world receiving military aid from America, millions and millions of dollars.
We have mentioned that. Do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, why we don't discuss the ideology of the FARC as a political organization representing the people who is being repressed in Colombia and in Latin America?
Thank you very much. I think we probably have mentioned that once or twice, but I'm going to take one there and the gentleman there, and then we're going to come back, so don't go away. Yeah.
Well, my name is Carolina, and
Hello,
my
Carolina.
question is basically, Uribe has been in power for the last 10 years. Paramilitaries, I think, around 12, 13. FARC, 44. And as long as I can remember, I'm Colombian, by the way, we have never been other way that is not neoliberal. So
You have never...
Sorry?
we haven't been with any other government that hasn't gone alongside with the states. So why is...
So you've always had a neoliberal government?
So far as I can remember, I'm 30. So far as I can remember, we've been in that thread.
Sure.
So why is now Uribe the problem? Just him, not just the political force.
Yeah.
So you think it's a longer...
It's a long, ongoing... Uribe is the name now, but it's going to change. It's just the political agenda that we
Okay.
have followed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to take one last question, and then we're going to give the panel a chance to come back.
Hi, good evening. Well, it's
Could you
it's a
tell us who
question
you are,
about-
please?
My name is Nicholas. Yep. I have to say 3 facts before my questions. Colombia is the old democratic in South America.
Is what?
The old democratic in South America.
The oldest,
Yeah,
democracy.
the oldest, sorry.
Democracy, yeah.
I thought Chile
Uribe
voted.
was elected and the way democratic from our Colombians.
Okay.
The guerrilla is fighting about 44 of, I think it's 52 years
Yeah.
ago. that's my question is about all the panel. In this side, we can see we have one president elect from the Colombians. At the moment, is 91.5% of the Colombians support him, and is re-elect. The guerrilla at the moment, I think, is 0.01000. I want to ask the panel, why you explain, because the panel is end of the FARC, how do you explain the FARC is surviving in this war when killing babies, when kidnap people, when put bombs in front of the church, when kidnap people in captivity, when people is in there, when is kidnap people only for economic reasons?
Yeah, okay.
And
So-
why this group and the European Union plus American is called terrorists? Why one terrorist group want to survive? Probably
Why do they want to survive?
Yeah, why?
You're
Why
asking us
survive?
why the FARC should wish to survive.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
52 years old, fine, but now I don't think so.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Right. So we have the question about the rural areas and what people, displaced people, could do otherwise. We have the question of neoliberal governments and why the FARC should wish to survive.
I mean, the regional
Let's go
question.
there.
I think the regional question is key because, I mean, to a large degree, Colombia is a country of regions. For example, the main natural resources, the oil resources, are on the east of Colombia, in an area which is Los Llanos, which is very much like Venezuela. The reason that Uribe doesn't need to move the army to the border is because they're already there. And the army is concentrated. I mean, I visited these oil regions, and I visited villages where the people who meet you off the bus are soldiers with guns, right? And in the BP in Casanare, the oil fields run by BP in Casanare, completely militarized by the army. In Arauca, which also borders Venezuela, where Occidental extracts the oil, completely militarized by the army. And in both these areas, paramilitaries operate with impunity. So if there is any opposition to the imposition of this extraction model to the benefit of US and British multinational corporations, the military are there to deal with it. So he doesn't need to move them to the border. The other area which is very important in this regard was mentioned is Nariño, which is in the southwest, right? I mean, the hope for people in these areas is very, very limited. And all the people who are backing Uribe, let me put it another way. All the people who don't want to support Uribe and don't want to support the FARC have to ask the question, what should we do, right? And I think what we should be doing is supporting the social movements in these regions. We should be, how much press coverage is there? It's almost like the banality of evil. I mean, there are people killed. There are indigenous people, campesinos, black people killed in these regions every day of every week, right? And Amnesty is poo-pooed and made fun of here on the platform. What they're doing, what Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, to their credit, are trying to do is alert the world's attention to this daily massacre that's taking place. And the hope for the people in those areas is you. I urge you to read what's going on and to start making real protests so that there is defense of human rights in Colombia. What is the point of a democracy when a democracy is a cover for ordinary people being systematically killed? There are 4 million displaced people in Colombia. Only Sudan has more displaced people. And in almost their entire majority, they've been displaced by the violence of the conflict, and almost all of them displaced by exemplary violence, horrible massacres by the paramilitaries. That is still the fundamental conflict in Colombia. So I appeal, I'm not asking people to support the FARC. I don't want to pretend that I am, I'm not. I appeal to everybody here to support human rights in Colombia, and in particular, support human rights in the regions and of the social movements.
Alice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the regional question is really interesting, and it kind of brings up the imbalance between how the victims of the violence have been dealt with as opposed to how the perpetrators of the violence have been dealt with. You know, there are kind of extensive government programs for reintegrating people who've been in the armed groups, and they get grants to set up projects and, you know, to set up businesses. They get you know, psychological support. They get a whole kind of package of different support measures to try and stop them going back into the armed groups. And on the other hand, the people who've been victims of the violence are often completely kind of, dismissed by the state. Their cases aren't looked into. Their paperwork's lost. There is a huge imbalance there. And I think, where Uribe has shown he's very strong is, the military battle, and where he really hasn't shown much imagination is in how you deal with the other side of the equation, really. And for that reason, I think it's very important now that Colombia now gets a breath of fresh air. And I think Uribe's supporters are currently organising petitions so that they can change the constitution and Uribe can come in for a third term. What I think Uribe has actually done an awful lot of good for Colombia. I think that it would be a very bad sign if he got in for another term. I think that really, a different approach needs to be taken now. But just on the point about human rights organisations and Amnesty International, I understand what Andy's saying, but I think the problem has been with a lot of the stuff that you see about Colombia that comes out from Amnesty and other organisations is that, obviously they have an obligation to report on human rights abuses that take place. That's what they're there for, and they concentrate on state abuses because that's what they're there for. They don't talk about guerrilla abuses because guerrilla. Well,
they do.
They've reported
not
very
as,
little.
Not as much.
There are a lot fewer.
No, but listen, Amnesty is there to criticise states. That's what Amnesty.
No, Amnesty is there to criticise human rights abuses.
Okay, they don't talk as much about the guerrilla violence. And I've talked to, I talk to people from Amnesty International. It's a conscious decision because they're there to criticise government policy and state policy, which I totally understand. But at the same time, I think often they haven't always set the abuses in the context of the other stuff that's happening in Colombia, which has actually, there have been big strides made towards, calming the situation down. When I lived there in 2001, it really felt like a country under siege. And you go back now, and admittedly this is in the cities, I know that it's a different story in the countryside, but you go back now, the atmosphere is totally different. It really is. And I think, sometimes you need to recognise that in order to carry on making criticisms, otherwise people will not listen to you.
And I don't know if you want to, Malcolm had said that Uribe is not a neoliberal, so I'm not going to ask this question of him because I know what he'll say. But a Colombian there thinks that he is a neoliberal and that there has been a long run of neoliberal governments, and once...
We can get into this ideological, philosophical now,
So
what
the
neoliberalism is.
My question was, why now
He's the
Uribe is
political.
the one that is carrying the blame of being neoliberal and trying to implement this kind of government?
Oh, I see. You
knowing
think
that
he's not doing anything different from his predecessors?
But probably...
The only difference is attacking frontally FARC and maybe ignoring the other attacks from other fronts, but in the economic front.
Then he's doing what everyone else is.
But probably that brings me the excuse to make my point again about the drugs industry. We cannot see a Colombia without that problem. Is the illegal drug industry where it's fueling the conflict. Since FARC decided to use, first to tax, then to export directly cocaine, then what they grew immensely militarily. I'm not talking ideologically here, if the justification for the existence of FARC or not. I'm just saying that, and also I joined that with the question of the regions. It's also a conflict where you need to have the land, where you can plant, where you can produce, where you can export. If you look at the territories that, for example, the Ochoa family used to have, which is people from the Medellin cartel, for those who doesn't know. They used to have all these corridors from the jungle into the Caribbean coast. So let's not take that out of the equation of what is the problem in Colombia. And then you have the United States, as you say, the governments, after government listen to the United States because Colombia is a very easy, advisable place, as Malcolm said at the early. So we've been fighting a war against drugs for the last 25, 30 years, and there is no results at all. Yeah. And that's one point that we cannot forget. We've been fighting this drugs war for 2-3 decades, and there is no results. The cocaine industry is booming. Let's make no mistake about it.
Okay. Malcolm promises to be
Yeah,
brief.
I promise to be brief, but I do feel I should say something to that question from the back. It's true that the situations in Choco, Nariño, Eastern Antioquia, a lot of places are dire, and the conflict displaces people. The conflict in a way displaces people when you cannot, the essence, usual displacement is when you can't do a deal with either side. If you've got just the FARC, okay, you could do a deal with the FARC. If you've got conflict, then you can't do a deal, and to survive you have to leave. Now, the only thing that will end that is the end of the conflict. And if you're looking at it from the government's point of view, and if you're looking at it from Uribe's point of view, the main priority is to end the conflict. You said that for these areas, Uribe is a disaster. I think those areas are disastrous. I think that the displacement is disastrous. All that is horrible. But I can't agree with you that the cause of that is Uribe.
Okay, thank you. Now, there was a question, this gentleman here. Do you have the microphone? It's just that we've got 5 minutes left. I wonder if there are a lot of people who'd like to ask a question, and I would really like to give them a chance. There's a gentleman there, there's a gentleman in blue there, and yeah. Okay, and that, I'm afraid, is going to be it.
Sorry, I speak in Spanish because my...
¿Cómo no?
Yo soy periodista, yo fui subeditor judicial del Tiempo en Bogotá
I'm a
durante muchos
journalist.
años.
I worked for El Tiempo in Bogotá for the benefit of those who don't.
He descubierto el conflicto colombiano de cerca.
And covered the conflict.
Actualmente trabajo aquí en Londres para aculcoradio.com, que es una radio latina online.
And works now for online radio in London.
Yeah. Mi cuestión no es realmente una pregunta, sino una opinión, pero que me gustaría que el profesor Malcolm Díaz opinara sobre ello.
Okay, pero cortita, se puede.
Okay.
It's an opinion.
No, yo siempre oigo, cuando se habla del conflicto colombiano, que el problema son las FARC para conseguir la paz en Colombia.
Okay, when I always hear when the conflict is discussed that the FARC are the problem.
Que las FARC son un tropiezo para alcanzar esa paz. Pero hay quienes creemos que las FARC son realmente una consecuencia de los problemas colombianos, básicamente de las desigualdades sociales que hay en el país.
But many of us believe that the FARC are a consequence of Colombia's problems, of the inequalities in Colombia.
El conflicto colombiano para mí es un problema de tierras.
It's a problem of land for me.
Yo como ejemplo le cito un caso reciente ocurrido con el ministro de Agricultura. Sobre la hacienda Carimagua en el oriente del país. Esa hacienda se la quitó el gobierno, se la quitaron los paramilitares a punta de fusiles a miles de campesinos, familias campesinas.
Okay, we're talking about thousands of peasants who were forced off land at the point of a gun by paramilitary forces.
Yes. Fueron desterrados de ahí.
Yep.
Y curiosamente ahora, cuando el gobierno recupera esas tierras, no se las devuelven los campesinos.
And when the government recovered that land recently, it was not returned to the peasants.
Se los entrega a los industriales de la palma, que son los ricos propietarios del país.
It was handed over instead to palm oil industrial agro-industry. Right. Okay. I'm going to have to stop quite soon.
Ese es un ejemplo para mí de que el problema colombiano es un problema de tierras.
Okay.
Y para rematar, las FARC en este momento están en territorios que son de extensión ganadera, a los cuales representa realmente el presidente Uribe.
Right.
Y las FARC se han convertido en un tropiezo para que esas tierras pasen realmente a los terratenientes del país, que son paramilitares y ganaderos.
We have the point. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you. Okay, now we really are close to time, so I'm going to ask you please to be brief and not to make extended speeches, but we're very interested in all your points.
Sorry. My name is Raúl Peña. I am asylum in this country for 12 years. I don't want to talk about me. I'm going to ask something to the Professor Malcolm Díaz, and it's concrete. Which one is the next orientation to Álvaro Uribe doing in Colombia after United States planning to put the new military base in Guajira? Instead, the place finish next year in Ecuador, and how they prepare and disappear the conflict with United States support.
Okay. Thank you. And there was down at the... Now we get to almost 2 minutes before the end. We have 20 people wanting to ask a question. There is a bar.
Hello.
And the lady next to you also. Yeah.
My name is Jairo. I want to make some question to Malcolm.
You're very popular.
Probably.
I'm going to get a chance to
Me,
answer.
but before Albo Uribe was elected, remember, probably you don't remember me, but before Albo Uribe was elected president, you were organizing some conference in London School Economics, London University College. Yeah. And you didn't allow a group of people go there and speak about the consequence to Colombia to organize paramilitary groups by the government. Remember, one question. The grant in Oxford University, you have got for him, and we tried to be there in order to explain. He was in London before he was elected. Could you imagine, after this many years, how the political situation in Colombia, in which nobody can speak again? Now, my question is possible a political movement in Colombia which challenge the power from the elite? From a simple fact. First,
okay, please be brief.
Yeah, okay.
We're really up to
First,
time.
before paramilitaries, army and political party was a different group. Now, from my region in which I am from, there is just a one regional mafia. In Colombia, in every department or region, it's the same thing. Second, the increase of the killing by the army. In Antioquia, in which there is no guerrilla movement, yesterday was a report in which
okay, no more reports. I'm sorry,
people
that's
was
it.
killed
You've
by
had
the
your
army.
time.
What you said about it?
Okay, could you give the microphone to the lady next door? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, mine is also just a comment because I lived in Colombia for 2 years working with Peace Brigades International as an accompanier and human rights observer. And I lived in Medellin and also in Urabá. And the first thing that I noticed is that actually in terms of media reporting, the media is completely controlled by the government, and so the government completely controls the propaganda, and so perhaps that's the reason why the majority of people that you speak to say that they are in support of Uribe or against the FARC. That's actually due to ignorance. The second thing, in terms of the professor saying that actually he would not classify the Colombian government as being far-right, neoconservative, I actually also worked in the peace community of San Jose de Apartador, and I was there during the massacre of February 2005, and I was part of the commission which was going into the mountains with the communities to find the mutilated bodies of 8 members of that peace community whose only crime was to refuse any engagement with the Colombian government due to the fact that it had killed over 100 people within a community of perhaps 600 people. And that is a crime that is currently still under investigation. And the people that were killed were aged from 35 to 18 months old, including a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old.
Okay. So. Thank you. At the risk of profound unpopularity, I really have to stop there. And I think, Malcolm, you're in the spotlight first, but I would like everybody to have a chance to come back, and then we're really officially over time. Malcolm.
Wait a minute.
Well, while you're looking up your notes.
What you say is untrue. Your accusation against me personally is just complete bunk. Again, I never stop anybody speaking anywhere.
Me?
No, I never stopped you.
We were there.
No, you. I never. I don't. I do not. I do not. Well, that's a proof. I do not control what goes on in colleges and universities in London, and so you misrepresent me, and I resent that.
Okay. Well,
Now,
that's the first
then the other thing on the causes. Your point. I think there are many causes. I don't think there is a single cause. I don't think you can say that violence in Colombia is un problema de tierras. It's many problems. It is problema de tierras in some places and sometimes. But it is not explicable simply as a problema de tierras. One of the reasons I can give for that is if you look at what the FARC says actually very, very little about land. Very little. You can find a Programa Agraria of the FARC, but you really have to look for it. This isn't essentially a struggle for land. It has, land enters into it in different places at different times. Now, when it comes again to, there was a question then about you mentioned the current scandal. I'm interested in you mentioning the current scandal de Caramagua. Now, what I hope will happen in Colombia is when you stop having such a high level of conflict, you will get a higher level of politics. I've said for years and years and years that what favors the right is conflict, that the armed struggle favors the right. La derecha se aprovecha más del conflicto que la izquierda. Many people now recognize that. You even get...
Okay, for those who don't speak Spanish, you said that the right benefits more from the conflict.
It is the right that, if you like, has benefited most. Because you cannot have politics with this, this level of conflict restricts politics enormously. It also restricts what, terrible things go on in Colombia. Okay. I never deny that. San Jose de Apartador, lots of places, terrible things go on. Now, it isn't adequate, though, just to say it's all the government's fault. It's all Mr. Uribe's fault.
Yeah, but it's the government that does it.
It is not the government that does it. It is all sorts of people that do it. It is sometimes the government that does it. But if you, again, there's a lot of serious study on who is responsible for what. You cannot. Of course, you can say that everything done by the paramilitaries, if you want a certain argument, is attributed to government. But I can't share that.
Why did I say it? Why did I agree to do this?
Well, I didn't say
mínimo. You're going to have to continue that in the bar. This lady has been trying to say something. Would you say something very brief, and then the rest of the panel will have to talk?
My name is Francesca Bellini. I write for El Nuevo Siglo. It's a national newspaper in Colombia. I want to ask this question in Spanish because I don't want to make mistakes.
All right, but please.
You speak great.
You sound good to me, but anyway,
Go for it.
Okay.
Una de las cosas que no se han mencionado profundamente es la figura de Ingrid Bettancourt una vez ya salió ya estuvo rescatada. Y ella como figura de izquierda anterior a que fuera secuestrada, sale mucho más uribista que Uribe mismo.
Okay, she's just saying that when Bettancourt was released, she came out as more uribista, having been a figure of the left.
No, really.
I'm not sure actually,
you read the interview.
You know what, I'm not sure we're going to have time to explore this.
Cuando digo en el momento que ella sale diciendo Uribe, incluso en sus palabras.
Diciendo gracias.
Claro, gracias, pero Uribe, la reelección, o sea, estos dos mandatos ha disminuido las FARC en una medida impresionante. Lo dice cuando baja del avión.
Okay, we do a round.
I'd really like you to finish what you're saying, and we need to get
la pregunta es sencillamente, o sea, en este panorama, ¿cómo entonces juzgar tan fuertemente a Uribe cuando ella sale diciendo precisamente esto, o sea, esto se lo agradezco al ejército de Uribe?
Okay, so did that give him political advantage? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now all we have time for at this point, just to be clear, is for us to go along the panel and wrap up. And we'll respond as we can to all the points made. Alice.
I don't know if I've really got anything else to say. I mean, I think we've
Excellent woman. Orlando, a woman who knows the value of stopping women.
Me neither.
The Trappist panel. Now, I have
just one point. Just one point is about information, and because I'm a journalist, I really need to say this. There's been a study of how the Colombian media cover things, and one of the problems with our media is that many times, I'm not saying always, we use one source. That's the only thing I want to say. Many times, the media in Colombia use one source of information, and then we read the papers, we watch the news, and it's one source.
Is that...
I don't know, you tell me, I read you for many years. So it's, if you say one source is official source, or it's either
on the other side. Okay, that was my question.
And it's, come on guys,
Okay. Yeah. Well, they may also reflect the fact that you can only hold one opinion in Colombia, it seems.
Pretty
You know,
much,
you're
and,
on one side
it will
or
be
the
very
other, and
difficult
it's
to have
very hard.
a nice discussion as this one. Then we'll be already into.
They would certainly win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think Ingrid Bettancourt has held about 4 opinions since she's been released from
Which she
covering.
can be forgiven for.
Which she can be forgiven for, but I don't want to seem harsh and inhumane, but I celebrate her return to her family. But I do have a class concept of this, right? She is a human face, a human being. There are 4 million or more people who are separated from their families, who are not human faces and human beings, who are not given names by the international media. And if we take the progressive side of what Ingrid Bettancourt says, which is the military solution cannot be solved until the social problem is solved. I mean, I think that I take that from her. I mean, in terms of the continuity of Uribe with what went before him, this is a book, famous writer about Latin America, André Gunther Frank. He talked about the lumpen bourgeoisie, a class which is criminal because of its conditions of existence. I say that since the Second World War, the Colombian elite has been conducting crimes as a group against its own population, more often than not supported by the United States. The guy who last said this was a Colombian journalist and comic called Jaime Garzón, and he was assassinated soon after. And he says, if Uribe comes to power, that's when the lumpen bourgeoisie will rule Colombia.
Okay, Andy, thank you. I think we're...
2 little points?
2 little points. It's been a woolly liberal chair here.
One is, first, my concluding remarks, one is there are many Colombias.
Okay.
There are
That's one little
Colombias like
point.
San Jose de Apartado, and there are many other Colombias.
Okay.
You can't generalize from the extremes.
Second
The second point is that you have a much better chance of solving social problems and improving human rights when you have a certain degree of order. That is a very basic fact about any country.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much to you. This is a very, very highly polarized and intense day. Thank you. Thank you to my panel.